Hi, and welcome to part 2 of Skrælige, where we talk about the colonial era of Skrælige's history. So where we left off was 29th of January, 1509, where a design of ship that the Skræligans had never seen before was sighted on the horizon. After the guards in the watchtower on the mouth of the Sigmund River saw this first ship, a second one soon followed. And after some initial confusion of what this could be, the watchmen lit a torch to try to signal to it. Quite what they were expecting, nobody knows, but the crew on board the mysterious ships maneuvered to anchor near that watchtower. And the signaling attracted the attention of the nearby chieftain of Nyjahofn, Afisson, who joined some guards to meet the ships. Neither of the two parties were really what the other expected. For the Skræligans, this was the first time seeing non-native outsiders since the 14th century, and the crew on board were expecting to see people more similar to the natives they saw earlier, not the Skræligans. And after the two parties cautiously greeted, a few men rowed from the ship to set foot on land, and they attempted to communicate with each other. This was a bit of a challenge because the Skræligans had their own language and a tiny bit of Algonquian and some Latin, but that Latin was only from the church and had drifted somewhat due to their isolation. But that broken Latin was the only way they had to communicate. And eventually they figured out that this was an expedition led by Sebastian Cabot, also known as Sebastiano Cabot, for King Henry VII of England, who had been searching for a northwest passage. At this point in the voyage, though, Sebastian Cabot had been traveling south because they had been forced to retreat back from Hudson Bay. So once the Skræligans realized the importance of what was happening, that they had made contact with the old world again, the Skræligans invited them upstream to meet with the Thing, and they put together a large feast, and they traded knowledge and goods. Unfortunately for Sebastian Cabot, though, the Skræligans did not know of any Northwest Passage, just that there were so-called hostile natives on the mainland. And this discovery of Skrælige still seemed useful to Cabot, though. A friendly settlement would be helpful to launch more expeditions from, and the tale of a lost Viking settlement might help secure funding for those further expeditions. In exchange for some modern steel weaponry, Skrælige would send a volunteer as an envoy to King Henry VII to prove the existence of Skrælige, just to, confirm that Sebastian Cabot wasn't lying. And Chieftain Affi's son Magnus Afisson volunteered, knowing that he would be gone for a few years. And then after 3 more nights, Cabot set off with his crew and Magnus to the southwest and eventually back to England. Unfortunately, Sebastian Cabot returned to England slightly after the death of King Henry VII in April 1509. The new king, Henry VIII, was not nearly as interested in exploring the New World, and even with the tale of the lost Viking settlement, he still wasn't interested. Cabot remained employed as a cartographer, but only for mainland Europe, and was unable to organize another westward expedition. Not much can be confirmed about Magnus's fate afterwards. Legend has it that after spending some time in Hampton Court, he traveled with Cabot to Spain and somehow managed to end up on a Basque fishing expedition to modern-day Newfoundland, and it's told that he managed to return to Skrælige by himself in the 1520s. There's some evidence this may have actually happened, but nothing conclusive. After the visit of Sebastian Cabot, Skrælige expected there to be more expeditions to come soon, but with Henry VIII's lack of enthusiasm, the next explorer to so-called discover Skrælige would be Estêvão Gomes on the 16th of February 1524, this time working for the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. Gomes's expedition was also surprised to see the Skræligans. Evidently, knowledge of the settlement had not spread much beyond the English crown. Gomes brought a rather unwelcome surprise for Skrælige as well: plague. The most significant one was smallpox, which had not been present in Skrælige since at least the 11th century. Just a side note, while the outbreak of disease in the 1060s is still not exactly known, there's some evidence that it could have been a less virulent strain of smallpox. Around 2 weeks after hosting Gomes and his crew, the pox began to appear, and this first wave of smallpox ended up killing about 30 to 40% of the Skræligan population. At first, the Abenaki were able to avoid catching smallpox. There was no trade between them and the Skræligans anymore, and contact in general was minimal, and eventually the smallpox epidemic burned out and was no longer present in Skrælige. However, unlike with Sebastian Cabot's expedition, Gomes's led to the start of further trade, in this case with New Spain. And this meant that a second wave of smallpox hit in 1543, further devastating Skrælige, and the Abenaki saw the weakness in Skrælige and launched a raid on Nordstader. And it was initially successful in pushing the Skræligans back, but it meant that some of the Abenaki brought back smallpox. And it was just as deadly for them. Rough estimates placed their losses around a third of their population. And this wasn't enough to completely destroy their society, but it did mark the beginning of the end for independent Abenaki culture on Skrælige. And natives on the mainland were fortunate to avoid the disease, but this would unfortunately not be true within a century. So as I mentioned earlier, the expedition of Estêvão Gomes meant that now the territories of New Spain and the Spanish West Indies were aware of the existence of Skrælige, and some merchants began to venture north. Even with the devastation left by the plague, the Skræligans were able to improve their quality of life through this trade. Goods that were previously unattainable due to isolation were available again, and all sorts of newer crops from the Spanish territories were available as well. While this trade was not officially sanctioned, Spanish officials generally looked the other way due to its relative insignificance. The trade was enough to justify some expanded port facilities for the larger Spanish ships, because unlike the Skræligan ships, Spanish ones were just too big to just land on shore and be carried inland. This new port, otherwise known as Nyjahofn, was completed by 1539 and allowed for traders to more easily load and unload their ships. Additional buildings allowed for the storage of goods and had a marketplace for the direct sale of goods to the Skræligans. What you've been seeing so far is just a time lapse of me actually building Nyjahofn, the new port facilities. This is the first time lapse that I've commentated for this series, and in fact ever, so please let me know what works and what doesn't. To start, we've got the concrete DIY docks by Strict Toaster all the way back in his Sinu series, I'm pretty sure. Is that while I have a lot of the block services here, they don't actually seem to have one for like the external passenger and cargo docks. So I could have made my own, but instead just decided to reuse that and slap some cobblestone on top. I was experimenting with a couple of ideas here, but mainly there's the main external port on the left that covers mostly cargo at this point, but passengers later. And then on the right, there's a little space for, well, we'd call it a ferry, but just the boats that go back and forth between Nordstader and Skrælingborg. And then also there's a fishing dock there. Then looking for a good main building for this port facility. Something decently sized and new, but not so big because, you know, the rest of the city's been undergoing some pretty dramatic depopulation. Had to make a PO, a procedural object, because otherwise it'd raise the terrain underneath where the water is, and wanted to have it overhanging. Normally I try to avoid procedural objects just because then I get too detailed and end up having to maintain a super high level of detail that on the scale of this project that's not really feasible. Then end up reusing the cranes that I have for the mining in Estêvão here. Probably not exactly what they would have used in a port like this, but it looks good enough. It fits in, so I'm fine with that. Also set up some, well, they're called bollards here. I'm pretty sure there's a technical term for it that isn't bollards, but basically just a place for ships to tie up while they're docked. And then adding some of the fancy Parisian market stalls that Gez made. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know, don't speak French. And then at one point right at the end here, looks like one of the concrete docks floods somehow. So I end up having to raise everything up, which I probably had to do anyway. Then finally, as we wrap things up here, just using PO to get more of a foundation for the main building. And then that's all for this time lapse. With the expanded trade and the devastation of smallpox, the Manntal of 1500 was incredibly outdated. So an early one was commissioned in 1540, and it found that the total population of Skrælige was down to 911, which was down by 353 people. Some of the biggest losses were in Skrælingborg, which was down by 226 people to 500, but most of the other villages lost substantial numbers of people as well. Throughout the rest of the 16th century, the population of Skrælige continued to decline due to disease. Trade helped sustain the settlements, but they certainly weren't thriving. In the meantime, knowledge of Skrælige's existence finally began to spread throughout Europe. In 1598, an expedition was sent by King Christian IV of Denmark to contact Skrælige and assert their authority over the islands. At this point, it's important to note that Christian IV was not just the King of Denmark, he was also the King of Norway, and that meant that he also ruled over Iceland and the Faroe Islands, and that was the justification for the claim. The voyage that was sent by King Christian IV was plagued by scurvy and significantly colder than expected temperatures, and about a third of the crew didn't make it. So when they finally saw Skrælige on the 21st of May, it was a welcome relief to them all. When the Skræligan port workers realized that these ships were no ordinary Spanish trade mission, meaning that the thing was quickly convened, it started slowly, because while the Danes and the Skræligans could somewhat understand each other's native languages, they had significantly diverged in the past centuries. But the crux of the matter was this: the Danish delegation offered the protection of King Christian IV, as well as trade and investment in exchange for swearing fealty to the king. This would mean that Skrælige would finally be united with Norway, as well as Denmark and Iceland and the Faroe Islands. After some deliberation, the Thing agreed to swear fealty to King Christian IV. Given the devastation of the plagues, Skrælige wasn't really in a position to say no. The investment from Denmark could help them recover, but it did mark an end to independence, at least for a few centuries. That brings Skrælige to just about the end of the 16th century. And the end of Chapter 5. Thanks so much for watching. I realize this episode's a little bit different just because there's more destruction than construction, and now the old world is involved again. But I hope you liked it. Thanks.